The Adventure of the Dancing Men. Holmes had been seated some hours in silence with his long, thin, black curved over a chemical vessel in which he was brewing a particularly malodorous product. His head was sunk upon his breast, and he looked from my point of view like a strange, lank bird with dull grey plumage and a black topknot. "So, Watson," he said suddenly, "do you not propose to invest in South African securities?" I gave a start of astonishment. Accustomed as I was to Holmes's curious faculties, this sudden intrusion into my most intimate thoughts was utterly inexplicable. "How on earth do you know that?" I asked. He wheeled upon his stool with a streaming test tube in his hand and a gleam of amusement in his deep-set eyes. "Now, Watson, confess yourself utterly taken aback," he said. "I am." "I ought to make you sign a paper to do that effect." "Why?" "Because in 5 minutes you will say that it is most so absurdly simple." "I'm sure that I shall say nothing of the kind." "You see, my dear Watson," he dropped his test tube in the rack and began to lecture with an air of a professor addressing his class. "It is really not difficult to construct a series of inferences, each dependent upon its predecessor and each simple in itself. If, after doing so, one simply knocks out all the central circumstances and presents one's audience with a starting point and the conclusion, one may produce a startling, though possibly a matriculous, effect. Now, it was not really difficult, by an inspection of the groove between your left forefinger and thumb, to feel sure that you did not propose to invest in your small capital in the gold fields." "I see no connection." "Very likely not. But I can quickly show you a close connection. Here are the missing links of the very simple chain. 1. You had chalk between your left finger and thumb when you returned from the club last night. 2. You put chalk there when you play billiards to steady the cue. 3. You never play billiards except with Thurston. 4. You told me 4 weeks ago that Thurston had an opinion on some South African property which would expire in the month, and which he desired you to share with him. 5. Your checkbook is locked in my drawer, and you have not asked for the key. 6. You do not propose to invest your money in this manner." "How absurdly simple!" I cried. "Quite so," he said, with a little nettled. "Every problem becomes very childish when once it is explained to you. Here's an unexplained one. See what you can make of this, my friend Watson." He tossed a sheet of paper on the table and turned once more to his chemical analysis. I looked with amazement at the absurd hieroglyphics upon the paper. "Why, Holmes, this is a child's drawing," I cried. "Oh, that's your idea?" "What else should it be?" "That is what Mr. Hilton Cubitt, of Ridingthorpe Manor, Norfolk, is very anxious to know. This little conundrum came by the first post, and he was to follow by the next train. There's a little ring at the bell, Watson. I should be very much surprised if this were he." A heavy step was heard upon the stairs, and an instant later there entered a tall, ruddy, clean-shaven gentleman, whose clear eyes and florid cheeks told me of a life led far from the fogs of Baker Street. He seemed to bring a whiff of his strong, fresh, bracing East Coast air with him as he entered. Having shaken hands with each of us, he was about to sit down when his eye rested upon the paper with the curious markings, which I had just examined and left upon the table. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, what do you make of these?" he cried. "They told me you were fond of queer mysteries, and I don't think you can find a queerer one than that. I sent the paper ahead so that you might have time to study it before I came." "It is certainly rather a curious production," said Holmes. "At first it would appear to be some childish prank. It consists of a number of absurd little dancing figures across the paper which they have been drawn. Why should you attribute any importance to so grotesque an object? I never should, Mr. Holmes, but my wife does. It is frightening her to death. She says nothing, but I can see the terror in her eyes. That's why I want to sift the matter into the bottom. Holmes held up the paper so that the sun shone upon it full. It was a page torn from a notebook. The markings were done in pencil, and ran in this way. I don't have a picture of it, sorry. Holmes examined it for some time, and then folding the pack carefully back up, he placed it in his pocketbook. This promises to be a most interesting and unusual case, he said. You gave me a few particulars of your letter, Mr. Hilton Cubitt, but I should very much be obliged if you would kindly go over it all again for the benefit of my friend Dr. Watson. I'm not much of a storyteller, said our visitor, nervously clasping and unclasping his great, strong hands. You'll just ask me anything that I don't make clear. I began at the time of my marriage last year. But I want to say, first of all, that though I'm not a rich man, my people have been in Ridlingthorpe for a matter of 5 centuries, and there are no better-known family in the county of Norfolk. Last year I came up to London for the Jubilee, and I stopped at a boarding house in Russell Square, because Parker, the vicar of our parish, was staying in it. There was an American lady there. Patrick was the name. Elise Patrick. In some way we became friends until my month was up, and I was as much in love as a man could be. We were quietly married at a registry office, and when we returned to Norfolk, a married couple. You'll think it very mad, Mr. Holmes, that a man of a good old family should marry a wife in this fashion, knowing nothing of her past or of her people. But if you saw her and knew her, it would help you to understand. She was very straight about it, was Elise. I can't say that she did not give me every chance of getting out of it if I wished to do so. I've had some very disagreeable associations in my life, she said. I wish to forget all about them. I would rather never allude to the past, for it is very painful to me. If you take me, Hilton, you'll make a woman who has nothing that she need be ashamed of. But you will have to be content with my word of it, and to allow me to be silent as all that has passed up to this time when I became yours. If these conditions are too hard, then go back to Norfolk and leave me to my lonely life in which you found me. It was only the day before our wedding that she said those very words to me. I told her that I was content to take her in my own terms, and I have been as good as my word. Well, we've been married now for a year, and very happily we've been. But about a month ago, at the end of June, I saw for the first time signs of trouble. One day when my wife received a letter from America, I saw the American stamp. She turned deadly white, read the letter, and threw it into the fire. She made no allusion to it afterwards, and I made none, for a promise is a promise. But she has never known an easy hour from that moment. There's always a look of fear upon her face, a look as if she were waiting and expecting. She would do better to trust me. She would find that I was her best friend. But until she speaks, I will say nothing. Mind you, she is a truthful woman, Mr. Holmes, and whatever trouble there may be in her past, it's been no fault of hers. I'm only a simple Norfolk squire, but there is not a man in England who ranks his family honor more highly than I do. She knows it well, and she knew it well before she married me. She would never bring any strain upon it, and that I am sure. Well, now I come to the queer part of my story. About a week ago, it was the Tuesday of last week, I found one of the windowsills a number of little absurd dancing figures like the one on the paper. They were scrawled with chalk. I thought it had been a stable boy who had drawn them, but the lad swore he knew nothing about it. Anyhow, they had come there during the night. I had them washed out, and I only mentioned the matter to my wife afterwards. To my surprise, she took it very seriously, and begged me if there were any more came to let her see them. None did come for a week, and then yesterday morning I found this paper lying on the sundial in the garden. I showed it to Elsie, and down she dropped in a dead faint. Since then, she has looked like a woman in a dream, half dazed and with terror always lurking in her eyes. It was then that I wrote and sent the paper to you, Mr. Holmes. It was not a thing that I would have taken to the police, for they would have laughed at me, but you will tell me what to do. I am not a rich man, but if there is any danger threatening my little woman, I would spend my last copper to shield her. He was a fine creature, this man of old English soil, simple, straight, and gentle, with his great, earnest blue eyes and broad, comely face. His love for his wife and his trust in her shone in his features. Holmes had listened to his story, and with the utmost attention, and now he sat for some time in silent thought. "Don't you think, Mr. Cubitt," he said at last, "that your best plan would be to take the mic of a direct appeal to your wife, and to ask her to share her secret with you?" Hilton Hubert shook his massive head. "Promise is a promise, Mr. Holmes. If Elsie wished me to tell me, she would. If not, it is not for me to force her confidence. But I am justified in taking my own line, and I will. Then I will help you with all my heart. In the first place, have you heard of any strangers being seen in your neighborhood?" "No." "I presume that it is a very quiet place. Any fresh face could cause comment?" "In the immediate neighborhood, yes, but we have several small watering places not very far away, and the farmers take in lodgers." "These hieroglyphs have evidently a meaning. If it were a purely arbitrary one, it may be impossible for us to solve it. If, on the other hand, it is systematic, I have no doubt that we shall get to the bottom of it. But this particular sample is so short that I can do nothing. The facts which you have brought me are so indefinite that we have no basis for an investigation. I would suggest that you return to Norfolk, that you keep a keen lookout, and that you take an exact copy of any fresh dancing men that may appear. It is 1,000 pities that we do not have reproduction of those which were first done in chalk on the windowsill. Make a discreet inquiry as to the strangers in the neighborhood. When you have collected some fresh evidence, come to me again. That is the best advice which I can give you, Mr. Hilton Hubert. If there are any pressing fresh developments, I shall be always ready to run down and see you in your Norfolk home." The interview left Sherlock Holmes very thoughtful, and several times in the next few days I saw him take his slip of paper from his notebook, and look long and earnestly at the curious figures inscribed upon it. He made no allusion to the affair, however, until one afternoon, a fortnight or so later, I was going out when he called me back. "You had better stay here, Watson." "Why?" "Because I had a wire from Hilton Cubitt this morning. You remember the Hilton Cubitt of the Dancing Men? He was to reach Liverpool Street at 1:20. He may be here at any moment. I gather from his wire that there has been some new incidents of importance." We had not long to wait, for Norfolk Squire came straight from the station as fast as his hansom could bring him. He was looking worried and depressed, with tired eyes and a lined forehead. "It's getting on my nerves, this business, Mr. Holmes," he said as he sank like a wearied man into an armchair. "It's bad enough to feel that you're surrounded by unseen, unknown folk who have some kind of design upon you, but when in addition to that, you know that it's just killing your wife by inches when it becomes as much as flesh and blood can endure. She's wearing away under it, just wearing away before my eyes." "Has she said anything yet?" No, Mr. Holmes, she's not. And yet there have been times when the poor girl has wanted to speak and yet could not quite bring herself to take the plunge. I have tried to help her, but I dare say I did it clumsily and scared her off from it. She's spoken about my old family and our reputation in the country and our pride and our unsullied honor. And I always felt it was leading to the point, but somehow it turned off before we got there. But you have found out something for yourself? A good deal, Mr. Holmes. I have several fresh dancing men pictures for you to examine. And what is more important, I have seen the fellow. What? The man who draws them? Yes, I saw him at his work, but I will tell you everything in order. When I got back after my visit to you, the very first thing I saw next morning was a fresh crop of dancing men. They'd been drawn in the chalk upon the black wooden door of the tool house, which stands beside the lawn in full view of the front windows. I took an exact copy. Here it is. He unfolded a paper and laid it upon the table. Excellent, said Holmes. Excellent. Pray continue. When I had taken the copy, he rubbed out the marks, but 2 mornings after, a fresh inscription had appeared. I have a copy of it here. Holmes rubbed his hands and chuckled with delight. Our material is rapidly accumulating, he said. 3 days later, a message was left scrawled upon paper and placed under a pebble upon the sundial. Here it is. The characters are, as you see, exactly the same as the last one. But that I determined to lie in wait, so I got out my revolver and I sat up in my study, which overlooks the lawn and the garden. About 2 in the morning, I was seated at the window, all being dark save for the moonlight outside, and I hear footsteps behind me. I was there with my wife in her dressing gown. She implored me to come to bed, and I told her frankly that I wished to see who it was who was playing such absurd tricks upon us. She answered that it was some senseless practical joke, and that I should not take any notice of it. If it really annoys you, Hilton, we might go and travel, you and I, and so avoid this nuisance. What, be driven out of our own house by a practical joker? Said I. Why, we should have had the whole country laughing at us. Well, come to bed, said she, and we will discuss it in the morning. Suddenly as she spoke, I saw her white face grow whiter yet in the moonlight, and her hand tightened upon my shoulder. Something was moving in the shadow of the tool house. I saw a dark, creeping figure which crawled around the corner and squatted in front of the door. Seizing up my pistol, I was rushing out when my wife threw her arms around me and held me with her convulsive strength. I tried to throw her off, but she clung to me most desperately. At last I got clear, but by the time I had opened the door and reached the house, the creature was gone. He had left his trace of his presence, however, for there on the door was the very same arrangement of dancing men which had appeared twice before, and which I have copied on that paper. There was no other sign of the fellow anywhere, though I ran all over the grounds, and yet the amazing thing is that he must have been there all the time, for when I examined the door again in the morning, he had scrawled some more of his pictures under the line which I had already seen. Have you that fresh drawing? Yes, it is very short, but I made a copy of it, and here it is. Again he produced a paper. A new dance was in this form. Tell me, Mr. Holmes, and I could see by his eyes that he was much excited. Was this a mere addition to the first, or did it appear to be entirely separate? It was on a different panel of the door. Excellent. This is far more important for all our purpose. It fills me with hopes. Now, Mr. Hilton Kubert, please continue your most interesting statement. I have nothing more to say, Mr. Holmes, except that I was angry with my wife that night for having held me back when I might have caught the skulking rascal. She said that she feared that I might come to harm. For an instant it had crossed my mind that perhaps what she really feared was that he might come to harm. For I could not doubt that she knew who this man was, and that he meant by these strange signals. But there is a tone in my wife's voice, Mr. Holmes, and a look in her eyes which forbid doubt, and I am sure that was indeed for my own safety that King was in her mind. There's a whole case, and now I want your advice as to what I ought to do. My own inclination is to put half a dozen of my farm lads up in the shrubbery, and when this fellow comes again, to give him such a hiding that he will leave us in peace for the future. I fear it is too deep a case for such simple remedies, said Holmes. How long can you stay in London? I must go back today. I would not leave my wife alone at night for anything. She is very nervous and begged me to come back. I dare say you are right, but if you could have stopped, I might possibly have been able to return with you in a day or two. Meanwhile, you will leave me these papers, and I think it very likely that I shall be able to pay you a visit shortly and to throw some light on your case. Sherlock Holmes preserved his calm professional manner until our visitor had left us, although it was easy for me, who knew him so well, to see that he was profoundly excited. The moment that Hilton Cubitt's broad back had disappeared through the door, my comrade rushed to the table, laid out all the slips of paper containing the dancing men in front of him, and threw himself into an intricate and elaborate calculation. For 2 hours I watched him as he covered sheet after sheet of paper with figures and letters, so completely absorbed in his task that he had evidently forgotten my presence. Sometimes he was making progress and whistled and sang as he worked. Sometimes he was puzzled and would sit for long spells with a furrowed brow and a vacant eye. Finally he sprang from the chair with a cry of satisfaction and walked up and down the room, rubbing his hands together. Then he wrote a long telegram upon cable form. If my answer is to this, I hope, you will have a very pretty case to add to your collection, Watson, he said. I expect that we shall be able to go down to Norfolk tomorrow, and to take our friends some very definite news as to the secret of this annoyance. I confess that I was filled with curiosity, but I was aware that Holmes liked to make his disclosures at his own time and in his own way. So I waited until it should suit him to take me into his confidence. But there was a delay in that answering telegram, and 2 days of impatience followed, during which Holmes picked up his ears at every ring of the bell. On the evening of the 2nd, there came a letter from Hilton Cubitt. All was quiet with him, save for a long inscription which appeared that morning upon the pedestal of the sundial. It enclosed a copy of it. Holmes bent over this grotesque frieze for some minutes, then suddenly sprang to his feet with an exclamation of surprise and dismay. His face was haggard with anxiety. We have let this affair go far enough, he said. Is there a train to Western Walsham tonight? I turned up the timetable. Last had just gone. Then we shall breakfast early and take our very first in the morning, said Holmes. Our presence is most urgently needed. Here is our expected cablegram. One moment, Mrs. Hudson. There may be an answer. No, that is quite what I expected. This message makes it even more essential that we should not lose an hour in letting Hilton Cubitt know how matters stand, for it is a singular and dangerous web in which our simple Norfolk squire is entangled. So, indeed, it proved, as I was to come to the dark conclusion of the story, which had seemed to me to be the only childish and bizarre I had experienced, once again in dismay of horror with which I was filled. Would that I have some brighter ending to communicate to my readers, but these are the chronicles of fact, and I must follow their dark crisis to the strange chain of events, which for some days made Redlingthorpe Manor a household word through the length and breadth of England. We had hardly alighted North Walsham and mentioned the name of our destination when the station master hurried towards us. "I suppose that you are the detectives from London," said he. A look of annoyance passed over Holmes's face. "What makes you think such a thing?" "Because Inspector Martin of Norwich has just passed through, but maybe you are the surgeons. She's not dead, or wasn't by last accounts. You may be in time to save her yet, though it will be for the gallows." Holmes's brow was dark with anxiety. "We are going to Ridlingthorpe Manor," said he, "but we have heard nothing of what has passed there." "It's a terrible business," said the station master. "They are shot, both Mr. Hilton Cubitt and his wife. She shot him, and then herself, so the servants say. He's dead, and her life is despaired of. Dear, dear, one of the oldest families in the county of Norfolk, and one of the most honoured." Without a word, Holmes hurried to a carriage, and during the long 7-mile drive he never opened his mouth. Seldom have I seen him so utterly despondent. He had been uneasy during our journey from town, and I had observed that he had turned over the morning papers with anxious attention. But now suddenly the realization of his worst fears had left him in the blank melancholy. He leaned back in his seat, lost in gloomy speculation. Yet there was much around us to interest us, for we were passing through as singular a countryside as any in England, where a few scattered cottages represented the population of today, while on every hand enormous square town churches bristled up from the flat, green landscape and told of the glory and prosperity of old. At last the violent rim of the German Ocean appeared over the green edge of the Norfolk coast, and the driver pointed with his whip to 2 old brick and timber gables which projected from the grove of trees. "That's Ridlingthorpe Manor," said he. As we drove up to the porticoed front door, I observed the front of it, beside the tennis lawn, a black tool-house and which pedestaled sundial with which we had such strange associations. A dapper little man with a quick, alert manner and a waxed mustache had just descended from a high dog-cart. He introduced himself as Inspector Martin from the Norfolk Constabulary, and he was considerably astonished when we heard the name of our companion. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, the only crime was only committed 3 this morning. How could you hear about it in London and get to spots as soon as I?" "I anticipated it. I came in hope of preventing it." "Then you must have important evidence, of which we are ignorant, for they said that they were no more a united couple." "I only have the evidence of the dancing men," said Holmes. "I will explain the matter to you later. Meanwhile, since it is too late to prevent this tragedy, I am very anxious that I should use the knowledge which I possessed in order to ensure that justice be done." Will you associate me with your investigation, or will you prefer that I should act independently? "I should be proud to feel you were acting together, Mr. Holmes," said the inspector earnestly. "In that case, I should be glad to hear the evidence and to examine the premises without an instant unnecessary delay." Inspector Martin had the good sense to allow my friend to do things in his own fashion, and contented himself with carefully noting the results. The local surgeon, an old white-haired man, had just come down from Mrs. Hilton Corbett's room, and he reported that her injuries were serious, but not necessarily fatal. The bullet had passed through the front of her brain, and it would probably come time before she could regain consciousness. On the question of whether she had been shot or had shot herself, he could not venture to express any decided opinion. Certainly the bullet had been discharged at very close quarters. There was only 1 pistol found in the room, and 2 barrels of which had been emptied. Mr. Hilton Cubitt had been shot through the heart. It was equally conceivable that he had shot her than himself, or that she had been the criminal, for the revolver lay upon the floor midway between them. "Has he been moved?" asked Holmes. "We have moved nothing except the lady. We should not leave her lying wounded upon the floor." "How long have you been here, Doctor?" "Since 4 o'clock. "Anyone else?" "Yes, just the constable here." "And you have touched nothing?" "Nothing." "You have acted with great discretion. Who sent for you?" "The housemaid, Saunders." "Was it she who gave the alarm?" "She and Mrs. King, the cook." "Where are they now?" "In the kitchen, I believe." "Then I think we had better hear their story at once." The old hall, oak-paneled and high-windowed, had been turned into a court of investigation. Holmes sat in a great old-fashioned chair, his inexorable eyes gleaming out of his haggard face. I could read in them a set purpose to devote his life to this quest until the client whom he had failed to save should at last be avenged. The trim Inspector Martin, the old grey-headed county doctor, myself, and a stolid village policeman made up the rest of that strange company. The two women told their story clearly enough. They had been aroused from their sleep by the sound of an explosion, which had been followed a minute later by a second one. They slept in adjoining rooms, and Mrs. King had rushed into Saunders. Together they had descended the stairs, the door of the study was open, and the candle was burning upon the table. Their master lay upon his face in the center of the room. He was quite dead. Now, the window, his wife was crouching, her head leaning against the wall. She was horribly wounded, and the side of her face was as red with blood. She breathed heavily, but was incapable of saying anything. The passage, as well as the room, was full of smoke and smell of powder. The window was certainly shut, and fastened upon the inside. Both women were positive upon this point. They had at once sent for the doctor and sent for the constable. Then, with the aid of the groom and the stable boy, they had conveyed the injured mistress to her room. Both she and her husband had occupied the bed. She was clad in her dress. He was in his dressing gown over his nightclothes. Nothing had been moved in the study. So far, they knew there had never been any quarrel between husband and wife. They had always looked upon them as a very amicable couple. These were the plain points of the servants' evidence. In answer to Inspector Martin, they were clear that every door was fastened upon the inside, and that no one could have escaped from the house. In answer to Holmes, they both remembered that they were conscious of the smell of powder from the moment that they ran out of their rooms upon the top floor. "I commend that fact very carefully to your attention," said Holmes to the professional colleague. "And now, I think that we are in position to undertake a thorough examination of the room." The study proved to be a small chamber, lined on 3 sides with books, and with a writing table facing the ordinary windows which looked out upon the garden. Our first attention was given to the body of the unfortunate squire, whose huge frame lay stretched across the floor. His disordered dress showed that he had hastily aroused from sleep. The bullet had been fired at him from the front, and had remained in his body after penetrating the heart. His death had certainly been instantaneous and painless. There was no powder marking upon either his dressing gown or his hands. According to the county surgeon, the lady had stains upon her face, but none upon her hand. "The absence of the latter means nothing, though its presence may mean everything," said Holmes. "Unless the powder from a badly fitting cartridge happens to spurt back towards, one may fire many shots without leaving a sign. I would suggest that Mr. Cubitt's body may now be moved. I suppose, Doctor, you have not recovered the bullet from the wound of the lady." "A serious operation will have to be necessary before that can be done, but there will be 4 cartridges from the revolver. 2 have been fired and 2 wounds inflicted, so each bullet can be accounted for." So it would seem, said Holmes. Perhaps you can account for the bullet which has so obviously struck the edge of the window. He turned suddenly, and his long, thin finger pointed at a hole which had been drilled right through the lower window latch, about an inch above the bottom. "By George," said the inspector, "how did you ever see that?" "Because I looked for it." "Wonderful," said the county doctor. "You're certainly right, sir. Then a third shot has been fired, and therefore a third person must have been present. But who could it have been, and how could they have gotten away?" "That is the problem which we are now about to solve," said Sherlock Holmes. "You remember, Inspector Martin, when the servants said that on leaving their room they were at once conscious of the smell of powder. I remarked that point was an extremely important one." "Yes, sir, but I confess I did not quite follow you." "It suggested that at the time of the firing the window was, as well as the door of the room, had been open. Otherwise the fumes of powder would not have been blown so rapidly through the house. A draught in the room was necessary for that. Both door and window were only open for a short time, however." "How do you prove that?" "Because the candle has not been gutted." "Capital! Capital!" cried the inspector. "Feeling sure that the window had been open at the time of the tragedy, I conceived that there might have been a third person in the affair. We stood outside this opening and fired through it. Any shot directed at this person might hit the sash. I looked, and there, sure enough, was the bullet mark." "But how came the window to be shut and fastened?" "The woman's first instinct would have been shut and fasten the window. But, hola, what's this?" "It was the lady's handbag which stood upon the study table. A trim little handbag of crocodile skin and silver." Holmes opened it and turned the contents out. There were 25-pound notes of the Bank of England, held together by an Indian rubber ink band. Nothing else. "This must be preserved, for it will be figuring in trial," said Holmes. But as he handed the bag and its contents to the inspector, "It is now necessary that we should try to throw some light upon the third bullet, which has clearly, from the splintering of the wood, been fired from inside the room. I should like to see Mrs. King, the cook, again. You said, Mrs. King, that you were awakened by a loud explosion. When you said that, did you mean it seemed to you to be louder than the second one?" "Well, sir, it awakened me from my sleep, so it's hard to judge. But it did seem very loud." "You don't think that there might have been two shots fired almost at the same instant?" "I'm sure I couldn't say, sir." "I believe that it undoubtedly so. I rather think, Inspector Martin, that we have now exhausted all that this room can teach us. If you will kindly step round with me, we shall see what fresh evidence the garden has to offer." A flower bed extended up from the study window, and we all broke into exclamation as we approached it. The flowers were trampled down, and the soft soil was imprinted all over with footmarks. Large masculine feet they were, with particularly long, sharp toes. Holmes hunted about among the grass and leaves like a retriever after a wounded bird. Then, with a cry of satisfaction, he bent forward and picked up a little brazen cylinder. "I thought so," he said. "The revolver had an ejector, and there's the third cartridge. I really think, Inspector Martin, that our case is almost complete." The county inspector's face shone in his intense amazement at the rapid and masterful progress of Holmes's investigation. At first he had shown some disposition to assert his own position, but now he was overcome with admiration and ready to follow without question wherever Holmes led. "Whom do you suspect?" he asked. "I'll go into that later. There are several points in this problem which I have not yet been able to explain as to yet. Now that I have gone so far as I best proceed on my own lines, and then clear the whole matter once and for all. Just as you wish, Mr. Holmes, so long as we get our man. I have no desire to make mysteries, but it is impossible at the moment to enter into long and complex explanations. I have the threads of the affair in my hand. Even if this lady should never recover consciousness, we can still reconstruct the events of last night and ensure that justice be done. First of all, I wish to know whether there is any inn in this neighborhood known as Eldridge's. The servants were cross-questioned, but none of them had heard of such a place. The stable boy threw a light upon the matter by remembering that a farmer of that name lived some miles off in the direction of East Ruston. Is it a lonely farm? Very lonely, sir. Perhaps they have not heard yet of what happened here during the night. Maybe not, sir. Holmes thought for a little, and then a curious smile played over his face. Saddle a horse, my lad, he said. I shall wish you to take a note to Eldridge's farm. He took from his pocket the various slips of the dancing men. With these in front of him, he worked for some time at a study table. He finally handed a note to the boy with directions to put it into the hands of the person to whom it was addressed, and especially to answer no questions of any sort which might be put to him. I saw that outside the note, addressed like straggling, irregular characters, very unlike Holmes's usual precise hand. It was assigned to Mr. Ab Slaney, Eldridge's Farm, East Ruston, Norfolk. I think, Inspector, Holmes remarked, that you would do well to telegraph for an escort, for if my calculations prove to be correct, you may have a particularly dangerous prisoner to convey to the county jail. The boy who takes this note could no doubt forward your telegram. If there is an afternoon train to town, Watson, I think we should do well to take it, as I have a chemical analysis with some interest to finish. This investigation draws rapidly to a close. When the youth had been dispatched with the note, Sherlock Holmes gave his instructions to the servants. If any visitor were to call asking for Mr. Hilton Gibbet, no information should be given as to his condition, but he has been to be shown at once into the drawing-room. He impressed these points upon them with the utmost earnestness. Finally, he led the way to the drawing-room with a remark that the business was now out of our hands, and that we must while away the time as best we might until we could see what was in store for us. The doctor had parted to his patients, and only the inspector and myself remained. I think that I can help you to pass an hour with an interesting and profitable manner, said Holmes, drawing up his chair to the table and spreading out in front of him the various papers upon which were recorded the antics of the drawing men. As to you, my friend Watson, I owe you the very atonement for having allowed your natural curiosity to remain so long unsatisfied. To you, Inspector, the whole incident may appeal to you as a remarkable professional study. I must tell you, first of all, the interesting circumstances connected with these previous consultations with Mr. Hilton Cubitt has had with me in the Baker Street. Then he shortly recapitulated the facts which I have already recorded. I have here in front of me these singular productions, at which one might smile had they not proved themselves to be the forerunners of so terrible a tragedy. I am fairly familiar with all forms of secret writings, and am myself an author of a trifling monograph upon the subject, in which I analyze 160 separate ciphers. Wow. But I confess that this is entirely new to me. The object of those who invented the system has apparently been to conceal that these characters convey a message, and to give the idea that they are mere random sketches of children. Having once recognized, however, that the symbol stood for letters, and having applied the rules which guide us in all forms of secret writings, the solution was easy enough. The first message submitted to me was so short that it was impossible for me to do more than to say with some confidence that the symbol, man standing with his arms up, stood for E. As you're aware, E is the most common letter in the English alphabet, and it predominates to so marked an extent in even a short sentence one could expect to find it most often. Out of 15 symbols in the first message, 4 were the same, so it was reasonable to be set down as E. It is also true that some cases the figure bearing a flag, and in some cases not, but it was probable from the way that which the flags were distributed that they were used to break the sentence up into words. I accepted the hypothesis and noted that E was represented by this symbol. But down came the near difficulty of the inquiry. The order of the English letters after the E is by no means well marked, and any preponderance which may be shown in an average of a printed sheet may be revised in a single short sentence. Speaking roughly, T, A, O, I, N, S, H, R, D, and L are the numerical order in which the letters occur, but T, A, O, and I are nearly abreast of each other, and it would be an endless task to try each combination until the meaning I arrived at. I, therefore, waited for fresh material. In my second interview with Mr. Hilton Cubitt, he was able to give me 2 other short sentences and 1 message, which appeared, since there was no flag, to be a single word. Here are the symbols. Now, in a single word, I've already got 2 E's coming second and fourth in their word of 5 letters. It might be sever, or lever, or never. There can be no question that the latter, as a reply and appeal, is far the most probable, and the circumstances pointed to it being the reply written by the lady. Accepting it as correct, we are now able to say that the symbols stand respectively as N, V, and R. Even now I am in considerable difficulty, but a happy thought put me in the possession of several other letters. It occurred to me that these appeals came, as I expected, from someone who had been intimate with the lady in their earlier life, a combination which contained 2 E's, with 3 letters between them. That might stand for Elsie. On examination I found that such a combination formed the termination of the message, which was 3 times repeated. It was certain to appeal to Elsie, and the way I had got to the 2 I, L, S, and I. But what could appeal it? There were only 4 letters in the word which preceded Elsie, and it ended in E. Surely the word must be come. I tried all 4 letters ending in E, and could find none that fit the case. So now I was in possession of C, O, and M, and I was in a position to attack the first message at once, dividing it into words and putting dots for each symbol, which is now still unknown. So treated it, I worked it out in this fashion. M, E, R, E, E, L, S, L, N, E. Now, the first letter of can only be an A, which is the most useful discovery, since it occurs in no fewer than 3 times in a short sentence, and the H is also apparent in the second word. Now it comes. Am here, A, E, slain. Or, filling in the obvious vacancies for the name, I am here, Abe Slaney. I had so many letters now that I could proceed with a considerable confidence to the second message, which worked out to be in this fashion: A, E-L-R-I-E-S. Here I could only make sense of it putting a T or G for the missing letters, and supposing that the name was that of some house or into at which the writer was staying. Inspector Martin and I had listened for the utmost interest to the full and clear account of how my friend had produced results which had led to the complete command over our difficulties. "What did you do then, sir?" asked the inspector. I have every reason to suppose that Abe Slancy was an American, and since Abe is an American contraction, and since a letter from American had been the starting point of the troubles, I had also every cause to think that there was some criminal secret in the matter. The lady's allusions to her past and her refusal to take her husband into her confidence both pointed in that direction. I therefore cabled to my friend Wilson Hargrave of the New York Police Bureau, who has been more than once of my use of knowledge of London crime. I asked him whether the name Abe Slaney was known to him. Here is his reply. The most dangerous crook in Chicago. On the very evening upon which I had his answer, Hilton Cubitt sent me a last message from Slaney. Working from the known letters, took this as... Elsie, R-E-R to meet thy go. An addition of the P and D duplicated the message which showed me that the rascal was proceeding with persuasion to threats, and my knowledge of the crooks of Chicago prepared me to find that he might very rapidly put his words into action. I at once came to Norfolk with my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, but unhappily only in time to find that the worst had already occurred. It is a privilege to be associated with this case. With you and the handling of the case, said the inspector warmly. You will excuse me, however, if I speak frankly to you. You are only answerable to yourself, but I have to answer to superiors. If this Abe Slaney living at Elridge's is indeed a murderer, and if he has made his escape while I'm seated here, I should certainly get into serious trouble. You need not be uneasy. He will not try to escape. How do you know? To fly would be a confession of guilt. Then let us go and arrest him. I expect him here very instant. But why should he come here? Because I've written him and asked him. But this is incredible, Mr. Holmes. Why should he come because you have asked him? Why should not such a request rather rouse his suspicion and cause him to fly? I think I have known how to frame the letter, said Sherlock Holmes. In fact, if I am not very much mistaken, here is the gentleman himself coming up the drive. A man was striding up the path which led to the door. He was a tall, handsome, swarthy fellow, clad in a suit of grey flannel, with a Panama hat, a bristling black beard, and a great aggressive hooked nose, and flourishing a cane as he walked. He swaggered up the path as if the place belonged to him, and we heard his loud, confident peal at the bell. I think, gentlemen, said Holmes quietly, that we had best take up our position behind the door. Every precaution is necessary when dealing with such a fellow. You will need your handcuffs, Inspector. You can leave the talking to me. We waited in silence for a moment, one of those minutes which one could never forget. Then the door opened and the man stepped in. In an instant, Holmes clapped a pistol to his head and Martin slapped the handcuffs round his wrists. It was all done so swiftly and deftly that the fellow was helpless before he knew what had struck. He glared from one to the other with his pair of black blazing eyes. Then he burst into a bitter laugh. "Oh, gentlemen, you have the drop on me this time. I seem to have been knocked up against something hard. But I came here in answer to a letter from Mrs. Hilton Chubett. Don't tell me that she is in on this. Don't tell me that she helped you set a trap for me. Mrs. Hilton Cubitt is seriously injured and is at death's door. The man gave a hoarse cry of grief which rang through in the house. You're crazy, he cried furiously. It was he that was hurt, not she. Who would have hurt little Elsie? I may have threatened her, God forgive me, but I would not have touched a hair of that pretty head. Take it back, you. Say that she is not hurt. She was found badly wounded by the side of her dead husband. He sank with a deep groan to the settee and buried his face in his manacled hands. For 5 minutes he was silent. Then he raised his face once more and spoke with the cold composure of despair. I have nothing to hide from you, gentlemen, said he. If I shot the man, he had his shot at me, but there's no murder in that. But if you think I could have hurt the woman, then you don't know either me or her. I tell you, there was never a man in the world who loved a woman more than I loved her. I had a right to her. She was pledged to me years ago. Who is this Englishman that he should come between us? I tell you that I had first right to her, and that I was only claiming my own. She broke away from your influence when she found the man you are, said Holmes sternly. She fled from America to avoid you, and she married an honorable gentleman in England. You dogged her and followed her and made her life a misery in order to induce her to abandon the husband whom she loved and respected, in order to fly with you, whom she feared and hated. You have ended by bringing about the death of a nobleman and driving his wife to suicide. That is your record in this business, Mr. Abe Slaney, and you will answer for it to the law. If Elsie dies, I care nothing about what becomes of me, said the American. He opened one of his hands and looked at the note crumpled in his palm. See here, mister, he cried with a gleam of suspicion in his eyes. You're not trying to scare me over this, are you? If the lady is hurt as bad as you say, who was it that wrote this note? He tossed it forwards to the table. I wrote it to bring you here. You wrote it? There is no one on earth outside the joint who knew the secret of our dancing men. How came you to narrate it? What one man can invent, another can discover, said Holmes. There's a cab coming to convey you to Norwich, Mrs. Slaney, but meanwhile you have come to make some small reparation for the injury you have wrought. Are you aware that Mrs. Hilton Cubitt has herself lain under grave suspicion of murder for her husband, and that it was only my presence here and the knowledge which I happened to possess which had saved her from the accusation? The least you owe her is to make it clear to the whole world that she was in no way, directly or indirectly, responsible for his tragic end. That's nothing better, said the American. I guess the very best cause I can make for myself is the absolute naked truth. It is my duty to warn you that it will be used against you, cried the inspector, which was magnificent fair play by the British criminal law. Slaney shrugged his shoulders. I'll chance that, he said. First of all, I want you gentlemen to understand that I have known the lady since she was a child. There were 7 of us in the gang in Chicago, and Elsie's father was the boss of the joint. He was a clever man, was old Patrick. It was he who invented the writing, which would pass as a child's scrawl unless you happened to have the key to it. Well, Elsie learned some of our ways, but she couldn't stand the business, and she had a bit of honest money of her, so she gave us all the slip and got away to London. She had been engaged to me, and she would have married me, I believe, if I had taken another profession. But she would have nothing to do with anything on the cross. It was only after her marriage to this Englishman that I was able to find out where she was. I wrote to her and got no answer. After that I came over, and as the letters were no use, I put the messages where she could read them. Well, I've been here a month now. I've lived in that farm where I had room down below, and could get in and out every night, no one the wiser. I tried all I could to coax Elsie away. I knew that she would read the messages, for once she wrote an answer under one of them. Then my temper got the better of me, and I began to threaten her. She sent me a letter then, imploring me to go away, and saying that it would break her heart if any scandal should come to her husband. She said that she would come down when her husband was asleep and at 3 in the morning and speak with me through the end window, if I should go away afterwards and leave her in peace. She came down and brought money with her, trying to bribe me to go. This made me mad, and I caught her arm and tried to pull her through the window. At that moment, in rushed the husband with his revolver in his hand. Elsie had sunk upon the floor, and we were face to face. I was healed also, but I held up my gun to scare him off and let me get away. He fired and missed me. I almost pulled off almost the same instant as he dropped down. I made my way across the garden, and as I went I heard the window shut behind me. That's the God's truth, gentlemen, every word of it, and I heard no more about it until that lad came riding up with a note which made me walk in here, like a jay, and give myself into your hands. A cab had driven up whilst the American had been talking. 2 uniformed policemen sat inside. Inspector Martin rose and touched his prisoner on the shoulder. It is time for us to go. Can I see her first? No, she is not conscious. Mr. Holmes, I only hope that if I ever see you again, in its important case, that I shall have the good fortune to have you by my side. We stood at the window and watched the cab drive away. As I turned back, my eye caught the pellet of paper which the prisoner had tossed upon the table. It was a note which Holmes had decoyed him. You can see if you can read it, Watson, said he, with a smile. It contained no word but the little line of dancing men. If you use the code which I have explained, said Holmes, you'll find that it simply means, come here at once. I was convinced that it would be an invitation which he would not refuse, since he could never imagine that it would come from anyone but the lady. And so, my dear Dr. Watson, we have ended by turning the dancing men to good, when they have so often been used as agents of evil. And I think that I have fulfilled my promise of giving you something unusual for your notebook. 3:40 is our train, and I fancy we should be back at Baker Street in time for dinner. Only one word of epilogue. The American, Abe Slaney, was condemned to death at the winter assizes in Norwich, but his penalty was changed to penal servitude in consideration of mitigating circumstances and the certainty that Hilton Cubert had fired the first shot. Of Mrs. Hilton Cubert, I only know that I have heard that she recovered entirely, and that she still remains a widow, devoting her whole life to the care of the poor and to the administration of her husband's estate.